The race is on, and is Ollie Bearman's Ferrari future assured after his star turn in the Mexican Grand Prix? And if it is, on what timeline? But what's going on with Red Bull's driver decisions? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to hit those topics and more are Nelson Valkenburg and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, Nelson, we'll come to you first. Ollie Bearman's star performance in Mexico attracted a lot of attention. Do you think he's done enough to be a nailed-on future Ferrari driver?
It depends on how long he has to wait, because an awful lot can go wrong in the meantime. But he did prove a lot to a lot of the naysayers, and he proved a lot, I think, to Ferrari. It's clear that Fred Vasseur is very, very much on his side. And timing-wise, it couldn't have come better, because this season, a real rookie season, he's shown speed, but he's been a little erratic. And this was such a measured performance that it came at the right time.
Yeah, I'd have to say, Scott, this is exactly the kind of thing that Haas have been crying out for from Bearman. He has had some good weekends before, but he's had more where he's been fast but not strung it together or something's gone wrong. So this is the kind of thing that was always a possibility to happen if he did string it together.
Yeah, it was the peak of what both Bearman and the team had been hinting at all year. There have been times where the Haas has been very quick, and it's not just been Bearman. Either the team's made mistakes, or sometimes it's Bearman on his own because Esteban Ocon's had a bad weekend. But this was one where both basically lived up to the full potential. I know there would probably be quite a few people that were crying out for Haas and Bearman to try and make the one-stop work and hang on to the podium. But I think actually it probably says a lot better about both Bearman and Haas that they didn't get drawn into chasing something like that, and actually focused on securing the best possible result. And that could have been third, fourth, or seventh, given who he was fighting against. Just to come out of it with that result is right at the upper end of what they've been threatening. So definitely something that both driver and team needed. But for Bearman, I think particularly important, because even he's been on a pretty good run since the summer break. But even, for example, in the US, where he did score points, that was slightly caveated by the fact that he did something unnecessary in the Grand Prix, had a spin, and that could have had much bigger consequences than it actually did. So to have just one of these where it was just like so clean, very, 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 very little else he could have done all weekend, yeah, absolutely perfect from him.
This is a really interesting thing for him. He's got this potential pathway to Ferrari. He's been on their driver academy, I think, since late 2021. So he is seen by them as a potential future Ferrari driver. And of course, he's a past Ferrari F1 driver, because he did that stand-in race to 7th place in Saudi Arabia last year. So that shows there's confidence there. But I don't know about you, Nelson. I think he could well get to that point, but he's still got quite a bit of heavy lifting to do before, if there is a vacancy at Ferrari, it's a foregone conclusion that he's promoted.
Right now, it's not a foregone conclusion. It's got a lot of proving to do, a lot of growing to do. But yeah, as far as rookie seasons go, I'd rather have quick but erratic with an upward trajectory. And I think Haas is the perfect team for him. He doesn't need to go to Ferrari next year. He has the time to improve there, learn the trade more, get more consistent, and then maybe make the move when there's an opportune moment. But I think he is clearly now the one that they'll invest most in to get him to a point where he's ready to go to Ferrari.
Yeah, still only 20 as well, so he can spend some time at Haas learning his trade and sharpening himself for that. I think an interesting comparison point, Scott, is Charles Leclerc, isn't it? Because I would say that Bearman's had he's made a good impression in his rookie season. He hasn't quite had the Leclerc Sauber 2018, though, that kind of compels Ferrari to move him up quickly, does he? He needs a little bit more time, which is not a huge criticism, because Leclerc's rookie season was really, really strong, at least after that initial shaky start.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I was actually about to come in off the back of what Nelson was saying and make a Leclerc comparison, and then I panicked and feared that it might actually be appearing later in the podcast. I was frantically trying to look for your outline to see if I was about to speak massively out of turn. So I'm relieved that you've thrown that to me. But yeah, I think it's telling, like that we've had that same thought. I was genuinely about to mention it. I don't think it's been a Leclerc level rookie season. I don't think he's had the machinery at times that that Sauber in in Leclerc's rookie season actually did have some races where it was genuinely good, especially once he and the team as well, but also like Leclerc got on top of some Bearman-esque struggles in the first few races, really quick pace, but some silly errors, which is completely fine in a rookie season. But, you know, it hasn't had that necessarily the, you know, sustained runs of Q3s, big points finishes until now, really, with that result in Mexico. That's much more Leclerc at Sauber. And so the difference between the two is kind of the quality of the rookie season and the situation that the older incumbent Ferrari driver finds themselves in. There are some parallels in that, because obviously Leclerc ousted the aging Kimi Raikkonen. Bearman's most likely route into Ferrari is going to be Lewis Hamilton calling it a day in Formula One. So you can see those parallels, and I think it's valid to draw some comparisons, especially on the driver performance side. So specifically what Bearman's doing and what Leclerc's done. Leclerc set a very, very high bar for a rookie F1 season when he came in. And so just because Bearman's not quite hit that level doesn't really reflect too badly on him at all. And I think more encouraging is that the peaks are there. Like, what Bearman did in Mexico is as good as anything Leclerc did in his rookie season. What he needs to do now over the final few weekends is make the final few weekends, not results-wise, that would be asking way too much of him, but performance-wise, execution-wise, if he can hit that Mexico level pretty much every weekend to the end of the season, we'll be reflecting on a rookie season that, because trajectory matters a lot more for a rookie than it's better to have good form than bad form for any driver, but it matters a lot more because it says a lot more about a rookie. I think you reflect then on Bearman's 2025 very differently to how you would have done even a couple of races ago.
What is interesting is what he's done to Esteban Ocon. Esteban Ocon feels like a non-factor in that team at the moment, and that's not what we expected. And he almost has accepted it if you look at Ocon, and it's new for him compared to how he was at other teams with other teammates. The fact that Bearman has been able to basically outpace Ocon on a lot of different tracks makes me very impressed with his rookie season, regardless what happens in the next few races.
Yeah, he was a great teammate to go up against for any rookie because he's a good one. So being more impressive than him counts for something, but he's also beatable. So that's a really good sweet spot if you're going to go in and try and make an impression as a rookie. And what's really stood out is Ocon, when everything's right and the car balance is what he wants, he can be really, really quick. And he's had some very strong weekends. But where Bearman's thrived, when the car's been a bit more unstable in the high speed, I mean, that's obviously your low speed understeer, high speed instability is a generic trait of these cars. Haas has been struggling a bit with that at times, but like Silverstone, they put the upgrade on. Bearman can handle a high speed instability. Ocon can't, and had to sort of dial back the setup a bit. The same thing happened at Austin, actually, where he had to dial out a little bit of front wing, which hurt him in other parts of the track in order to get the high-speed stability that he wants. So that measure has also shown what Bearman is good at in terms of kind of hustling the car and tolerance for that instability.
The way that's played out is probably at the slightly more extreme end of what I would have expected to happen with Bearman and Ocon. I would expect Bearman to have higher peaks. I would expect Ocon to be the slightly more dependable driver over the course of the season. But because of how highly rated Bearman was and still is, I thought, especially in the first half of the year, I thought the gap in execution would be less than it was. You know, right from the start, Bearman was making mistakes he should not have been making, and you couldn't just ascribe them to, you know, youthful impetuance or you know, rookie errors or whatever. But also very early on, you know, from Japan, there were signs that Ocon just could not go with Bearman. Bearman could take that car to a place Ocon was not going to get near. And on Ocon's better weekends, he's slightly faster than Ollie or pretty much right there. You know, there's very little between them in terms of pace actually in Mexico. But Bearman nailed it when it counted. Ocon didn't. And then Bearman was very opportunistic with a slightly better track position advantage, but not one that should have been translated into fourth place versus where Ocon started, right? So I think as the season's gone on, and I think certainly recently as Bearman started to tidy things up again, maybe then it is becoming a bit more, not only does Bearman have, the higher peak than Ocon, but actually, just the base level is higher. And you would expect that in the final part of a rookie season, especially the rookie season of a driver that is tipped to be a future Ferrari driver, coming back to the point and the sort of framing of this podcast. Whereas Ocon is what Ocon is, which is, he's a race winner, he's a podium finisher. He is, I think, genuinely one of F1's very best and most robust drivers in a, right, you've got a chance here, can you take it scenario. I don't think there are many better than Ocon in terms of actually grabbing that. But he's also capable of some anonymous weekends. He's had a few times this year where he's been hinting at mystery car problems and things like that. So he isn't an absolute, he's not a number one driver for a top team. Otherwise, all due respect to both parties, he wouldn't be at Haas now. But that doesn't mean he's not a good reference to judge Bearman against.
Yeah, what's been interesting with Bearman is, as you say, very early in the season he was putting in some good performances. It was kind of all over the map early on because he had that terrible Australia where he crashed on Friday and in Saturday practice. That was a bit of a write-off of a weekend. Even in that race where Ocon had the really strong result in China, Bearman had the terrible qualifying but came through with a good race drive. There have been weekends like Imola where the results on paper were dreadful, but actually that was all outside of Bearman's hands. He'd have been in the points had he not hit a red flag in qualifying and had they actually attached the front right wheel at his pit stop. And then you have ones like Silverstone where he crashes in the pit entry after the red flag. Instance in races, for example, USA and Monza, where, I mean, at Monza, regardless of what the penalty, who the penalty was given to, you sort of look at it and think, well, what was that the best decision-making process in terms of where you're putting your car? It's kind of been the classic rookie season in that regard, hasn't it, Nelson? With the high peaks, but the low lows. You just sort of willing them on to stop finding ways to get things wrong.
He feels also so young when you talk to him that we tend to forget when these kids get into these F1 cars that they are so young. But when you talk to a guy like Bearman, you think, oh, geez, you've got a long career ahead of you because you are so young. That's why it's so impressive that he is tidying it up. And you only have to sit down with Komatsu, the Haas team principal, to understand, A, how much they love the guy, but B, how much they expect from him and that they want more from him than they've seen so far. And that's what we heard a little bit from Ferrari as well in the last few months. Like, okay, it's really good, but he has growing to do. And it seems to me that he's picked up a little bit that challenge and is making it his own. And that makes it great and makes it a great rookie season for him. So I'm very impressed.
There's an element of the job Bearman did in 2024 counting against him slightly this year. Not just because it raised expectations externally amongst fans and probably ourselves as well, because you saw what he could do in the hardest of circumstances, like stepping into a Ferrari mid-weekend in Saudi. But also remember the way that he got into the Haas in Brazil was also very challenging circumstances. And actually, he should have done more with that chance in Brazil, however hard it was, and the conditions were obviously awful in the race, but he was way too scruffy. But the pace was mega considering the way that he came into it. And even his only normal weekend in 24, when he had the whole Azerbaijan weekend as Kevin Magnussen's replacement, that started out with, it was a bit shaky. He had problems through practice. He needed to recover from that, and he actually ended up doing a really good job by the end of it. But also internally within Haas, I think there was, and Komatsu, when I've spoken to him a couple of times this year, has admitted to this, sometimes more overtly, in more overt ways than others. But they made a bit of a mistake at the start of this year by effectively stopping treating him as a rookie because they knew him so well. He did his first FP1 in Mexico 2 years ago, and Komatsu was raving about him even back then. Then he's raced with the team. He's done FP1s and stuff last year. He's also just proven himself to be able to perform at the level of an established Grand Prix driver. So there was a little bit too much of not asking too much too soon, but just forgetting a little bit that there were a few things you need to drill into a rookie driver. So Haas isn't to blame for what Bearman did in Australia, for example. The Friday crash was the kind of crash that can happen. The Saturday one was unforgivable, careless from Bearman, not really pushing, just drifted onto the grass. But things like, let's say Bahrain at the start of the year, where Bearman sat out FP1, and basically Haas underestimated his ability to judge how the track would change over the sessions that he did have, and how quickly he would be able to get back up to speed. And in hindsight, Haas would actually run a few things slightly differently for Bearman that weekend, including giving him an extra set of softs for Q1, burner set there, because Ocon got through very comfortably, but Bearman didn't because he was still struggling. He also had, did he have some braking issues as well that weekend, so he just wasn't on top of the car, and he needed more time. And the team treated him a bit too much like an established, experienced driver. Obviously, as the season's gone on, there have been times where it's not like there's, his inexperience is an excuse or anything like that. Like, you don't forgive Silverstone just because, young driver, that's what young drivers do. And it's not that Haas didn't tell him not to crash under a red flag or anything like that. But I think there are a few times where it's like, actually, the first part of the year, maybe the first few races of the year, Haas would maybe have treated Bearman a little bit differently and not just, assumed or acted like they had someone who was fully established on the grid.
Should we throw in a quick question from the Race Members Club now, which is pertinent to this? It's actually two questions from Kyle Tyler Biggs. Should Ferrari be seriously considering putting Ollie Bearman in the car and benching Lewis entirely? And Bob asks, how much pressure should Hamilton feel from Bearman? What do you think, Nelson?
I'm going to get in trouble. If you are building for the future, instead of in 2026 going for a lot of wins, and why wouldn't you? Because you've got Leclerc. You might as well put Bearman there and work on not only Bearman, but give yourself some insurance for the moment that maybe Leclerc moves on. They are awfully exposed right now with things not going their way. And I think they have someone in Bearman who they can mold, who they can work with to be, we don't know how good he'll be, but good enough to win races. And I love Lewis going to Ferrari, but if it's another season like he's enduring now, what is the point of it? Also from Ferrari's standpoint, you might as well invest in a driver that can go on for the next 5-6 years. And that won't be Lewis because of the fact that the time just keeps on ticking. Now, we know Lewis still has great performances in him, but is that going to be enough? If I were Fred Vasseur, I would probably make a different call. But luckily I'm not, because that's a very difficult call to make with someone with the pedigree and the experience that Hamilton has, and experience that maybe Ferrari needs.
Yeah, I think it would probably be a more interesting or more possible thing to happen if A, Bearman had been doing a full-on sort of Leclerc season, and B, if Hamilton hadn't sort of picked up, because Hamilton sort of quietly got himself to a better level, hasn't he, Scott? He's in recent times, he's generally kind of been a tenth behind Leclerc, which is, I think, a reasonable place to be at this stage. So it does actually feel that while the main Ferrari storyline is disappointment, they haven't managed to turn the season around, actually Hamilton's got himself to not where he wants to be, but to a kind of decent staging point for next year, you could say.
Yeah, I was thinking actually when Nelson was speaking, it was like he'd gone 12 months into the future and brought back with him my answer to that question in 12 months' time. Because I certainly think by the time we're at the end of 26, unless two things change, which is one, the Ferrari story in general, and two, Lewis's performances within Ferrari relative to Leclerc, I can't really see the benefit in continuing into 27. I get why Ferrari would want to at least have a second year of their big investment and making sure that it comes off. I also think like Lewis will just, having kind of hoped that the change to Ferrari would unpick a few of the demons of the last few years, he'll also want to try the new cars. He'll hope that, something about the new cars gels a bit better, not just for him, but also that Ferrari's more on the front foot. And Bearman, I think, to come back to that kind of Leclerc comparison, and I mentioned that there's some parallels with Hamilton being in the Raikkonen position in 2018, but I don't think it's obviously Ferrari's in a different place there, so it's kind of hard to compare. I think Raikkonen had kind of overstayed his place at Ferrari by a season or two by that point, and certainly there are many people who think that entire second stint at Ferrari was just nowhere near at the level that anyone expected it to be in terms of Raikkonen and Ferrari. So hard to say sort of, it's not, the point here isn't to make a direct comparison between what job Lewis is doing now and what Kimi was doing then. But you don't necessarily have the same thing where like Leclerc was such an obvious immediate, like it was like, okay, yeah, why not put him in the Ferrari now? This guy looks absolutely incredible. And it was also a push reason as well. It's like, is there any reason not to push out Raikkonen at this stage? Don't think the equation is quite as strong in this instance. I think certainly, as Nelson said, like you can make arguments for not keeping Lewis, and you can definitely make arguments for promoting Bearman sooner rather than later. The 2026 new car one is also an argument to put Ollie in now, or for next season, because it's a reset. He'll have loads of time testing their car in pre-season, assuming obviously it runs reliably. So it'll be the best way for him to be prepared for the longer term. So, but it's just, yeah, it's not. I don't want to disrespect Raikkonen when I say this. I don't think it's as clear cut as should we replace Raikkonen with Leclerc like 7 years ago.
Especially since Hamilton has picked up. Otherwise, it would have been different.
But it does all point to a very promising situation for Bearman, because he's got to do more, certainly, but he's got to do more you'd expect him still to have to do more at this stage in his first full season. But if he builds at the level he should do, whether there's a vacancy for 27 or for 28, that puts him in a very promising position, doesn't it?
Yeah, and to come back, I think Nelson mentioned it earlier in terms of like what kind of rookie season you'd like to have. I mean, I'd rather he's not in the seat and Kimi Antonelli is, but I'd probably rather be in Bearman's position in terms of what's ahead of me and what potential I have is kind of more in my control, insofar as Bearman's shown the speed already. He's got the results in that car to a degree, especially after Mexico. So it's more I'm already fast enough, I need to tidy it up and then do it more regularly. That's fine. Whereas Antonelli, I think, even though he's in the car, he's in the Mercedes already, he might be in the place he desperately wants to be for the next few years if they're on top in 2026 or in the years that follow. So that should be, it is in his control in that he's the incumbent rather than, trying to get into the team. But he hasn't had that like absolutely drop dead weekend where you're just like, wow, like this kid's definitely going to win races in the future. Like he's come really close to that a couple of times, and he's been on the podium in Canada. I'm not trying to take anything away from him, but he hasn't had that kind of, wow, this guy's really, really fast, look at him as an F1 driver weekend yet. So that's what I'm saying. Like there's an argument that even though he's not in the top team already, actually Bearman's in a better position after this rookie season in terms of what he can control, what he needs to do. Because that was what made me think about it, Ed, when you said that. It's like what he needs to do is basically just do what he's done, but do it more often. He doesn't have to do anything he hasn't already shown in F1 is kind of my point.
And for Antonelli to have a weekend where he shines and with the Mercedes gets on the podium, he will need to beat George Russell, who's firing on all cylinders, and he has one of the strongest teammates in on the grid next to him. But it is a very interesting question now: which driver had the best rookie season if we would finish the season now? And it's just such a strong and interesting crop of drivers.
Yeah, we did that podcast a bit too early, didn't we, Ed?
Oh, we can do it again. Well,
when we
did it in the middle of the season, we ended up with it being ranked as Hadjar, Bearman, Bortoleto, although I was the dissenting voice there because I had it as Hadjar, Bortoleto, Bearman. However, what's happened since the break, I think, would change that. I think you've got a stronger case for Bearman there. So, yeah, we'll definitely come back to that at the end of the season, but it's kind of still in the balance because Bearman has certainly the consistency has stepped up since the August break, even though it's still not quite there. So, yeah, it's going to mean trajectory, as I think we've said, is very important. So the last 4 events are going to be quite important in how that one shakes out. Let's move on to another aspect of the driver market now, something a little bit more immediate, Scott, because the Mexican Grand Prix was supposed to be the cutoff point for Red Bull deciding what it was going to do with Yuki Tsunoda, Isaac Hadjar, etc., etc. So What's gone on there, and are we going to see a decision made before Brazil, or have things changed a little bit?
It still might have been the cut-off internally. You never really know what people are thinking privately, and wouldn't really want to guess what Helmut Marko's thinking anytime, to be honest. But the way it is now, certainly the way it's being framed, because I asked Laurent Mekies, the team principal, about this after the race in Mexico, is they've decided to take more time with it. Their intention is still to decide before the end of the season, and that means basically before Abu Dhabi. But it's not going to be. I think they'll run more races basically. So whether that means just Brazil and then doing it before the triple header, or it means giving them Vegas and Qatar as well, and then just deciding in the week before Abu Dhabi, not really sure. The argument, well, there's a few arguments for it. One, apparently, according to Mekies anyway, is that even though it's not been stunningly good, like Tsunoda's, we can use that word again, trajectory is better. You know, he's either been scoring points or looking faster, not necessarily at the same time, unfortunately, which is why it's still so messy. I feel like over the last 2 or 3 weekends, we've now seen Tsunoda be really close to Verstappen on one lap pace. We've seen him do really combative, aggressive, well-executed opening laps or first couple of laps. We've seen him score better points than he has in the past. We've seen him run sort of similar-ish, if slightly slower, stints to Verstappen. That was in Mexico until it went wrong. But the problem is that they haven't all happened at the same time. And that's why he's still in a position where, his best points return from a weekend, I think, is 8, which he's done a couple of times now across the US sprint and race. And then when he had finished 6th, didn't he? His best result when it was in Azerbaijan. And that's nothing when you think that Max is out there still winning races and trying to fight for the championship. But what Red Bull is seeing is enough for them to think, well, let's just give him a bit more time and see what he comes up with. So that there's that for starters. One element of it as well is that they just don't need to rush. They've got everyone under contract for next year. They can do whatever they want. This is just the way Red Bull operates. But the third element of it is the most interesting one, I think, and it's the new-ish development, which has basically got a bit of a dilemma on their hands because Max is accidentally in a title fight again, and I use accidentally because they wasn't meant to be after Zandvoort when they were talking about Mexico being the cutoff point. That was when Max was over 100 points away, right? So it wasn't really a factor. But now Red Bull, and this is a word that I've heard used internally, and Mekies has referenced, well, is there's a risk of a distraction. If the 2026 driver talk, announcement, fallout from it, whatever, becomes the bigger thing, that takes away from what Red Bull's focus needs to be on, which is basically making as many weekends as possible of the remaining 5 perfect. And Tsunoda does have a role to play there if he can. It's not just Max's title battle. They're trying to get second in the Constructors' Championship. He has to score points. If you end up announcing that he's dropped or deciding that he's dropped or whatever, there is a risk that he's not at his best. There's a risk that there's too much kind of noise around the team in general. There's a secondary Racing Bulls aspect to this because they really need to finish 6th in the championship, so they need their drivers to be at best. But what happens if one of them's bitten demoted? Even Hadjar, who's desperate to end on a high there and get them 6th in the championship, you can make the argument that if he knows for sure he is a Red Bull Racing driver next year, what's to stop him zoning out a little bit at the end of the year or whatever? So there's quite a few things at play here. I don't think that necessarily means the decision changes. They might just stick by the vibe that's been the case for a while now, which is Hadjar in, Tsunoda out, and then one of Hadjar and Tsunoda partnering Arvid Lindblad at Racing Bulls. But it's interesting that they've changed approach and felt the need to admit publicly they've changed it. Because obviously, apart from Marko doing his usual thing and just talking to people and sort of speaking on behalf of Red Bull, even though sometimes he's not meant to speak on behalf of Red Bull, it's not like they went out and went, right, we are definitely going to decide this and announce this after Mexico. So to then come out and say they're taking more time has to mean something.
Now, it's extremely difficult to evaluate the performance of the second Red Bull drivers, as we've discovered over recent years. But obviously, the performance metric that tells a story is the fact Tsunoda has 25 points to Verstappen's 285 in their races together, which is pretty concerning. But there are also signs of improvement for Tsunoda. But Nelson, you said earlier you're not in Fred Vasseur's position, but I'm going to put you in the position of Helmut Marko and Laurent Mekies and everyone else who's got a say in terms of the Red Bull driver decision. how would you evaluate Tsunoda? What decision would you make in terms of how you arrange your cards in those 4 seats?
Then I'll have my cake and eat it too. I'll probably put Hadjar in at Red Bull. I'll put Tsunoda in at Racing Bulls next to Lindblad, simply because I think he might be a easier benchmark for Lindblad and more of an assistance if we treat the Racing Bulls car as a driver development car, then having someone like Tsunoda with a third opportunity and a grateful Tsunoda next to you as a better benchmark than the more combative Lawson. And then I'll just call someone at Alpine and put Lawson in that car. That's my solution for everything.
Well, there's always a way to arrange that sort of thing, but
yeah, it's called money.
Well, exactly. Yeah, certainly where Alpine's concerned. But Scott, it does seem pretty clear that Lindblad is someone Red Bull wants to get into F1 next year, regardless of how up and down his F2 season's been.
It's someone I think Marko wants to get into F1 next year. Certainly, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, like dangerous ground to try and guess what Marko's thinking, but it just feels like Lindblad's now in that kind of sphere of Marko influence where it's just like, well, I want this guy to be in F1. I know he's young, super young. I know he's inexperienced. I know he's had this up and down F2 season, as you say, Ed, and he's got wrapped up some, not all of his own making, but a couple of mistakes and big incidents here and there. But he's also done things which Marko would have loved, which is, he's done that FP1 run, for example, in Mexico. And regardless of the fact that, track evolution means that going out at the very end and outpacing Tsunoda has a big asterisk against it because of track evolution at that place. There's also just the simple fact that he was in Verstappen's car and they entrusted him to run the new floor. He was entrusted to do that reference time at the end of the session. They were interested enough in getting that benchmark time, and he did the job, and they spoke very, very highly of him afterwards. So it feels like Lindblad might get the benefit of the doubt on the F2 stuff, and whether he wins the title or not, how he finishes the F2 season, feels like that would be outweighed by what they think they'll gain from giving him the F1 experience. I think he would. I can't see him getting a complete free pass for the final F2 rounds. Like, if he had 2 absolute horror shows, that might put enough doubt in their mind to continue doing Tsunoda-Lawson combination and then basically do an early season switch if one of them's being a bit underwhelming and Lindblad's doing well in TPC or whatever. But it does feel like it's going to be Lindblad +1 at Racing Bulls.
Yeah, I tend to agree. F2 is just no longer the benchmark in terms of how your season progresses. It's all about TPC. It's all about those Friday runs. The question you have with if you put Tsunoda and Lawson in the cars, what's the point of Racing Bull? What's the point of Racing Bull with both those drivers there? If they want to keep promoting talent, if that is the reason of its existence, then just do it and figure it out. And it seems to me that Helmut Marko is moving in that direction with Lindblad. He's definitely completely convinced by him.
Now, to come back to Tsunoda, you could argue that Mexico is about the performance level they're looking for their second drive. So like a little bit better, but he was 2 tenths off in qualifying, albeit that was in Q2. And you would rather have that measure in Q3, and Tsunoda should have got through to Q3, really. But his race pace was pretty decent, sort of in a similar kind of ballpark, maybe slightly further off than that. But it wasn't like Azerbaijan where he was miles off in qualifying, but the race pace was okay. So Mexico seemed to be a weekend where he got okay qualifying pace and okay race pace. So if he does that and he repeats it, say in Brazil, Las Vegas, Qatar, does that change the equation? Do they look at it and think, actually, we've got someone who's got to the level where they can do the number 2 job we want, or is that still not good enough?
I don't think it's enough. It wouldn't be for me. Austin was points-wise okay, but he was about a minute off in terms of race pace. And he dropped off quite considerably in Mexico as well. And considering what Max is doing, either we accept that Max Verstappen is by a country mile the greatest driver in this field, and no one will succeed there, or you have to aim higher than what Tsunoda is doing, and it's not enough. I don't think by now it's enough. He's getting better, but what's the trajectory then? If we're using that word again, how good is he then? What is the normal placing he can achieve? 6th, 5th? Is that enough if Max is winning? I don't think so.
No, it's considering what we were talking about earlier in terms of what should Ferrari do with Bearman and what's the timeline there, I think this is much more like that obvious equation of where you have a very good younger driver who is worth putting into your top team in Isaac Hadjar, and the way he's performed in general. He's back. It's actually unfortunate for Hadjar in terms of this timing, and this might be one of the reasons why Red Bull just wants to make sure that pressure's kept on him, because he had the crash in qualifying in Austin. He then made a costly mistake on the opening lap in Mexico, which basically defined the rest of his race. He was really probably the most annoyed, just like silently annoyed at himself I've seen him all year, actually, in the mix zone afterwards. I don't know what he was like to TV cameras, if you know, Nelson, but like he basically was one word answers the entire time to us when he came over.
He was pretty pissed off, yes.
Yeah. So, he is his own harshest critical. I know it's such a cliche, but like, I think he might actually be that. Like, he's a bit like Charles Leclerc or even sometimes Lando Norris in that regard. But he has generally been very good. I think he is a slightly better caliber of young driver than Tsunoda looked at his best in the junior in the junior team, for example. So in that sense, it's, given the purpose of Red Bull having two F1 teams, there's a very, very good reason to give that guy a chance in the top team, especially when the incumbent in the top team is performing how Tsunoda is. Now, there are flashes of it, and I would dearly love him to do a whole weekend. Like, Mexico was the closest I think he's come in terms of the pace all round. He's very unlucky. I think he got... Red Bull extended his opening stint, didn't they? And then that lost him time there. Then the slow pit stop as well, which cost him, 10 seconds, but also track position versus a couple of cars as well. So then the rest of that stint, you can't do a direct comparison there. He should have scored points. I don't think he would have scored as many points as he thinks he would have done in that race had it run normally. But if you look at that and say, okay, your baseline now for the rest of the season has to be that, which is qualify within around a couple attempts off Verstappen, on the weekends where the car is better, I think is the key caveat there, and race how you look like you were racing, which is, okay, it's at the back of the train of lead cars like Mercedes, McLarens, Ferraris, whatever, but you're in the mix-ish. You're not absolutely disconnected. But what I said within that about the potential of the car, I think is key. And I'm not going to use artificial ceiling, Ed, because we had a long discussion about this in Austin. Mexico, I know you don't like the phrase. But when that car's ceiling is lower, when track conditions or characteristics or whatever ends up playing into it, that means in qualifying or whatever, the Red Bull's a bit off it. This was a bit more Hungary-esque in terms of how Max was talking, the pace of the car, and the proximity of Tsunoda to him over one lap. That tells me something. That tells me that when that car's not capable of being like closer to what Max Verstappen can do as a driver, then Tsunoda can get closer and he looks better. But is he looking better because Max is being held back more than normal? That would be my number one question from a weekend like Mexico, which is why I don't think it's a bad thing to give him a few more weekends, because you just kind of want an emphatic understanding of like where that ceiling is within that, and also just that little bit of like, what's Hadjar doing at the moment? Is he going off it a little bit because he thinks he's sorted? Is it just one of those things that can happen during a rookie season? So I think there's enough. I think there's enough to be interested to see how a weekend like Brazil plays out, and then also like Vegas, because it's a bit strange. But then surely you've seen enough before. You don't need to even get to Qatar, really. You could argue you don't even need to get to now. But yeah, you definitely need to see more from Tsunoda. Like, even his best at the moment hasn't quite been at the level required.
I think the main thing is Red Bull needs to get this whole situation under control. They need to stop putting drivers into Red Bull too early. They've got this 4-seat setup. They should have it ideally lined up. They should have drivers perfectly prepared. They should be able to take a driver like Hadjar and say, right, you've had your 3 years, you're fully ready to step up and do it. But for years now, they've been going round and round in circles doing the same thing. And you get late in the season, it's like, oh, they're going to keep such as that. It's like the point that was being made about, oh, we don't want to create uncertainty and disrupt the season. It's already happened because the second Red Bull driver is constantly on trial because they never get it right. They need to think about, right, do we need to do something different with the way we're managing these drivers? Do we need to take a completely different approach and just go for the best driver from outside we can possibly get? Because this has been going on ever since Daniel Ricciardo left. That is a very, very long time. I actually think it's quite embarrassing for Red Bull, which for the most part in Formula One does things very, very well. But the driver thing has been an absolute mess.
When you were talking there, all I could hear in my head, Ed, was say the line about how they should run things and what position they should be in. But you avoided saying next cab off the rank, so I tip my hat. I tip my hat to you. What I was going to say more seriously, off the back of what you're saying there is, if they decide to make a change, Max has his fourth different teammate at the start of 26 in just over 12 months, which is just, it's so obvious as to not need stating, but I will anyway, is nowhere near the level of sort of line up competence and decision making competence and strategic competence that a team like Red Bull should be operating at, and it is at odds with everything else about the way that team runs in terms of, obviously, you see it's back to its best again in terms of the way that it operates the car, the way that it goes into weekends. Mexico was, I thought, a really interesting example because actually it started the weekend really well in terms of one lap pace, but they knew they had a big problem in terms of race pace, whether that was cooling, time management, a combination of both, whatever. Yes, it was looking a bit bleak after qualifying, and the first stint was difficult when there was obviously the different tyre choices at play and the way they wanted to run the race, but actually the position they ended up in at the very end and the way Verstappen did a very, very good job in the second half of the race shows that Red Bull actually played that quite well, didn't it, as a racing team? So I think so much of that is still razor sharp as an organisation. To leave something like as important as the driver situation, not up to chance, but just so often sort of acting like they kind of want it to resolve itself, which I think is another thing we've discussed a few times, is just a bit strange. And that's also one of the reasons why I think you could argue that maybe stability and keeping Tsunoda, not just for the sake of it, but just to avoid more instability, to be like, well, look, we've done the change in season. Next year it's new regs. He'll have a whole pre-season, a whole testing. Like I'd argue that's probably the strongest single argument to keep him, like irrespective of performance. If you were going to rank them, like that's probably, and that says a lot also about the way Tsunoda's been performing too, right? So they're in a difficult position. It's a decision of Marko's own making as one of the key stakeholders within the team, but also, former boss Christian Horner has, a lot of responsibility to bear on that too. And so do the ultimate decision makers in Austria, where this is obviously now being run as a corporate project, special project now. So kind of everything that's happening now is just a consequence, it's a function of everything we've been saying for years now. As Ed says, like going back to Ricciardo leaving and just never really having that succession plan or the patience required to make a succession plan work. So all of that is to say, I think, put Hadjar in for next year, but make a proper go of making Hadjar work and give him time if it doesn't. Like, don't just toss him out at the end of the year for yet another one.
Does Max care about this situation, Nelson, do you think?
He does, in a sense that he needs some backup in a title fight. I don't think he minds either way who's next to him, but because he's supremely confident of his own position within the team, that's for sure. But I think he's been quite supportive of Yuki Tsunoda, as he was with Liam Lawson. It is interesting to see that Max usually just focuses on himself anyway, because that's the way he operates at his highest level. But he needs some backup. So I know for certain he would like a driver that's closer, but wouldn't beat him, but closer, so that there is at least the option of a strategic call. And he might need that in the final 4 races. But that's not yet where Tsunoda is. So from that respect, I think Max cares.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Max isn't the kind of driver who stitches up his teammate other than by the simple fact of being Max Verstappen, which creates a very, very difficult measure.
I would disagree with that on the basis of witnessing Brazil 2022. He will also stitch up his teammate if it suits him because he's got a personal axe to grind in that situation.
Yeah, that's a slightly different on-track thing, though, isn't it? Right, I'm thinking more of the global.
Yeah, the behaviour.
The
exactly.
week in, week out. Yeah. But you're right. There have been a few specific instances, but worth mentioning. Well, we're going to finish off by devoting the third part of the podcast to questions from the Race Members Club. Thanks to everybody who's sent them in. As always, if you're interested in the Race Members Club and all of the extra content that we do, which is extra podcasts, extra videos, absolutely everything, is a thriving community, then click the link in the episode description or have a look on Patreon and search for the race and you can find out more. The first question is going to go to you, Nelson. It's a very simple one from Andrew Sillett. Why wouldn't Renault sell up at this point?
I don't know. That's the clear and easy answer, because what's the point of that team unless to make Renault some money by selling it and making it probably a lot of money given the popularity of F1. The thing is, there may be not a whole lot of people willing to buy at the price that Flavio probably would be asking for it, for Renault and for himself probably as well. He'd probably get a cut. But that team seems to have no purpose right now. It exists, but it's at the back of the grid. They're all waiting for the Mercedes engine, but it's a fairly unhappy team. I've been thinking that it would be Horner with a consortium. That seems the most likely one, but so far we hear no movement or news on that. But by now, you can really ask yourself what the point of that team is right now. So sell.
Yeah, I think it's a question of just finding the price, isn't it? And I presume they would imagine that price will be pushed up if they have a decent first part of the season next year. But yeah, I can't see how they're not going to be the fourth best Mercedes-powered team of the four. So yeah, still a big question to be answered there. Right, Scott, a question from Ansi Rullamo. If Ferrari does manage to finish second in the Constructors' Championship, mainly thanks to having two drivers capable of scoring consistently, how much does it salvage their disappointing season?
It doesn't. In isolation, it doesn't. Finishing second in the championship in the way that this season's gone and the way that battle for second has played out means relatively little, because it's beaten a one-car team in Red Bull and a 1.5-car team in Mercedes, because Kimi Antonelli was missing for chunks of the season and hasn't scored as highly as he would have wanted and Mercedes would have wanted and probably expected as well. That phase of the year where, even had Toto Wolff admitting that it was underwhelming from Antonelli at one point. The only thing I would add to that is if that second place is secured by one or ideally a couple of wins before the end of the year, in which Ferrari has conclusively been the best team that weekend, because much of Fred Vasseur's defence of its season at times has come down to there would have been much better results on the table if they'd actually executed the weekend better. That's happened far too often for it to be a legitimate excuse over the course of the season. But if you did manage to win, let's say, a couple of the races between now, let's say one of the sprint weekends and maybe another one, Vegas, take advantage of the fact that it's usually an unusual weekend there, then maybe you've got a bit more of a, right, look, see, we can actually make a car that is just simply faster than anybody else's. We have been a weak race team this year. New rules for next year, let's go. I think that might be just enough of an uptick to just kick that old Ferrari cycle back into motion, which is just when you stop believing, they do just enough to make you believe again. You start believing, and then that hope kills you. So that's the kind of situation, that's the best case scenario I think I can imagine for them in the final few races.
I think you just explained Charles Leclerc's life.
I feel like we've definitely had a lot of opportunity this year to get into that side of things, so much so I think that I'm not saying it was directly because of us, but I suspect we fed into the narrative that meant Leclerc was on damage limitation when we came back at the US Grand Prix at Austin, and he was quite at pains to point out that he really does believe in Ferrari and he's really happy at Ferrari and all of this. But as we're into members' questions now, there's a reason that members were asking us just a few weeks ago if Ferrari has finally broken him.
Right, next question I'll take from Duncan Bertram. Is Verstappen the most impressive title challenger since Alonso in 2012? I'm thinking specifically drivers running in inferior cars to the title favourites. Well, I think you'd have to say yes, because it's pretty rare to get somebody in a car that over the season has been a step behind the other title contenders to be in the hunt. So I think it's been hugely impressive. You could say it's one of the great underdog seasons, but they don't happen very often, which is why really the last time there was one probably was Alonso, because every other time you've had either teammates battling for the title, so by definition the same car, or you've had, like in 18 and 21, we had two teams at similar levels that were, in the case of 18, not for the whole season, but certainly in 21 going at it. So I think that this, whatever happens now, pretty much with Verstappen's title challenge, it's going to go down as one of the, at worst, as kind of a heroic title tilt that didn't come off. And it could be more than that if he isn't able to pull it off. So yeah, certainly most impressive, since Alonso in 2012 from an underdog. Right, Nelson, a simple question again now from husbandspoke.store. Why are the FIA so inconsistent when it comes to stewarding?
Oh, I'm gonna get in trouble again. I think they've made the rulebook so thick, and they want an answer, a clear-cut answer for everything, that they've lost exactly what they've wanted to achieve. So it seems to me that the FIA looks at every incident like this. We need to have a culprit, we need to have a victim, and we need to have a clear penalty. Those three things needs to be there. But sometimes it's not as clear cut, and then it suddenly becomes very inconsistent. Whereas if you would have stewarding that and rules that would allow for common sense, instead of having a minor rule for everything, then suddenly there may be some more consistency if you indeed have the same stewards at every race and they're well paid and they're a professional part of our sport. At this point today, we don't.
Sorry, I was just about to say, like, I think the problem is you just end up having like the extreme version of just life in a sport that has to be officiated in the modern day, because I think because people often ask for consistency, and I think sometimes it gets asked for without really knowing what that would mean or what they actually want to be consistent. But in basic terms, it's you want a sensible set of guidelines to be consistently applied within sort of, and this is subjective, a sensible amount of interpretation. Because nobody is going to view it the same. And even if you had permanent stewards or they're not professional in the sense that they're getting paid, but we have sort of semi-permanent stewards, don't we? In that, like, it's not a total ragtag team weekend to weekend, and over the course of the year you get 24 different compositions or whatever it ends up being. But you want to have something that is like, I want to be able to watch a race and have an idea of what the outcome's going to be. Whereas right now, honestly, I just often feel like I'm missing something, whether that's because guidelines are being applied as actual regulations rather than just guidelines. You know, we've had times this season where it feels like there's no such thing as a racing incident anymore, and then something that you think, well, I would have assumed that would be a penalty, ends up being a racing incident and no further action. And I think Mexico, which is obviously a trigger point for this kind of question, it's just a great example of it, because I think from that we had decisions in that race which were completely understandable from a regulatory point of view, which were things I don't personally agree with but can be explained by the regulations. And then we just had stuff that just seemed to be missed and just doesn't make sense, like kind of however you apply. And that's the frustration for me, is like I go through that race and I look back at it afterwards and I think, well, how have one or two drivers not been punished for what happened at the start? Is it just genuinely carte blanche now in terms of how you approach turn one at a track like Mexico? What happens if we go to Brazil and someone just absolutely guns it round the outside through the S's across the runoff and just chances their arm and see where they comes out? If it's going to be so obviously premeditated, I'd like to think they would do something about it, but who knows anymore. But you know, there's other things that have happened. Like, I understand why a lot of people don't like it, but like the Lewis Hamilton penalty, I think 10 seconds is unnecessary for something that he's done like that. But at the same time, I understand why you need to penalise that, because a pass has been completed by going off track. He's also put a tiny bit of a buffer between himself and a group of cars he could have been swallowed up by, whatever. So that kind of thing's fine. And yeah, like the Verstappen Hamilton thing through turns 1 and 2, personally, I think Max was was slightly on the too aggressive side for me into turn one, but then Hamilton gave as good as he got back into turn two, so Max cut the course, and then I don't want to necessarily encourage this, but that felt a little bit like two wrongs equaling a right, and actually, per the guidelines anyway, Max was actually fine into turn one. So like I get that, but there's just so much within it now. Like you're never gonna get identical outcomes for similar but not identical scenarios. Like if you do, it's by chance rather than by design. And I'm kind of fine with that. I don't like the kind of weird kind of hot pot situation that we have in terms of what the rules are in a particular environment, because you've got the F1 regulations within the FIA, you've got the FIA Sporting Code, and then you've got various guidelines and things that get discussed behind the scenes that, yeah, it just makes it hard. It makes it very hard to follow.
And in our Viaplay broadcast, we just spend so much time trying to explain rules and explain why penalties have or have not been given. And that's just a measure of the fact that it's not really working. And then you get to the next race and you do Thursday press conference and you have three drivers bemoaning penalties they may or may not have gotten. I think in Qatar there's going to be a big meeting with the drivers about this, because there's a lot of drivers that are very unhappy at the moment. The big question is the FIA going to incorporate that into a more, let's say, wholesome approach?
The big problem is it's the very pursuit of consistency that creates inconsistency, because you create these guidelines that sound sensible enough, and then you keep adding guidelines. Like a good example actually was the Verstappen turn one thing at the start when he was on the outside. Now the rule there is, well, if you have to go off at the start, as long as you rejoin where you were, that's okay. Now in isolation, that sounds like a perfectly reasonable statement, doesn't it? Until you bear in mind the fact that you can put your car in a risky position, because I don't think Verstappen comes out fourth place if he doesn't go to the outside and do what he did. And I've got no problem with him doing that, because the rules and the guidelines are what they are. So he knew what he could do, and he knew he had the ability to pull it off just about. It was perhaps a little bit more leery than he would have wanted, but that's the kind of situation that you get backed into. And it's only the only way I think you can get, ironically, a more consistent thing is to have less of that, because the drivers will demand consistency and guidelines and that kind of thing, then complain when they're applied. And this is just the constant maelstrom that goes round and round in terms of trying to get this under control. And one thing we do know is the drivers, or at least the clever ones, will absolutely play those guidelines to the maximum, as in fact they arguably should, because rules are rules, aren't they? So you do what you can to play things to your advantage. And whenever we have discussion of this, we always get the problems of when we talk about whether something should have been a penalty or should not. And we'll say, well, based on the guidelines, yeah, they made the right decision. And then we get people having to go, so you're defending the stewards. And it's like, well, the stewards are kind of pushed into following the guidelines. And they are only guidelines, but they become de facto regulations. And so they end up with their hands tied. And the stewards aren't always happy about it, because they have to look at it and think, say, well, we have to do that. So, yeah, it's an unending mess. And I honestly think the only way to do it is to have less regulation and guideline on it, and probably professional stewards to do that. It's not saying that the stewards are amateur in their approach, but I think professionalisation of referees in sport is a logical move, and F1 must be comfortably the biggest and most wealthy sport in the world, or sporting competition in the world rather, that doesn't do that. So that's probably the best direction for the future. Right, Scott, a question from Kid Coltrane. With all the changes F1 is making, are they risking losing its core fans chasing casual ones?
This is a very tricky one to answer, because I think what you view as a core fan and what could cost them is subjective. In my opinion, the best answer I can give on this, and this is using a fairly small sample set, but it's close to home, so it kind of gives me the strongest sense of it, which is that we've had a few interactions now, either just by chance bumping into people who, fans that have gone to races and tell us that they listen to the podcast, they watch the video, they're part of the members club. And I would now say in excess of 90% of those interactions, the explanation of how they found us is that they started watching F1 through Drive to Survive on Netflix, and it either got them back into F1 when they'd been a casual fan before, but fallen out of it, or they'd never seen it before, right? And I would say that if you're looking at what I assume the person in the question is asking, about a core F1 fan sort of consists of and wants from F1, we're pretty niche in terms of what we go into, the detail that we go into, like how hardcore the analysis is. So if those are new fans that feel that we are accessible enough and interesting enough to want to be the way that they consume F1, and they've got the desire to learn that side of F1 beyond the kind of surface level stuff, then why can't a new fan be a core fan? Why can't a new fan become a core fan? What's the tipping point there? And we've discussed this internally, and my opinion of it is it's basically investment. At what point, if you become willing to invest time or money or both into following Formula One, I don't think you're a new fan. I don't think you're a casual fan. So I don't think it's necessarily as binary as... And this isn't a dig at the question, by the way, because I thought this as well. Like, there was definitely a point where I was very sceptical that casual fans who only followed F1 because they watched it on Drive to Survive would really become, properly... I thought it's obviously possible that some will, for sure, but I honestly thought the bar would be quite high, and it would be too high for people that can just follow it that casually to then do more. But I have to say, my anecdotal evidence, my experiences of hearing from these people, speaking to these people, I think it's happened. I don't know the numbers. I might be massively wrong, and it turns out I'm just bumping into a pleasingly loud, tiny minority. But I don't think it's as clear cut as that. So yeah, maybe there is a risk. In fact, I'm sure there is a risk. Of course there is. There's a risk of everything, right? So if they go too aggressive because they see loads of opportunities in what seems to me to be really weird and different ways of trying to market F1 and make F1 more interesting and whatever, yeah, it might be that it makes F1 completely unpalatable for me. It might make it so that a lot of people that currently watch it now hate it going forward. Like, that could happen. I honestly have changed my view of the kind of new fan over the last kind of year or two. I have become more gently encouraged by it. So yeah, I appreciate it's a bit of a non-committal answer, but that's the best perspective I can give on it at the moment.
You could also argue that the biggest risk F1's got in the next 12 months is that next year's regulations don't work very well and don't create exciting racing. If it's the worst end of the prediction, I think it still should be very interesting, and it's never as bad as it could be. But if it's at the worst end of that, that will probably cost fans, and that's nothing to do with the fans. That was a completely different set of parameters that led to those regulations being created. So, yeah, it's what are the pressure points in the decision-making process. Right, final question from Just OS. Would it be beneficial to the racing spectacle in Mexico City at altitude if the teams were allowed to fit 2 standard-issue fans to improve cooling? Getting the impression that cooling demands have had a greater influence on racing up here than is necessary or good for the show. Well, I actually quite like it because it's such an outlier, being well over 2,200 metres. So it creates an interesting challenge. It's not quite as simple as just bolting on cooling fans, because your cooling capacity is dictated by a number of other factors. Your ability to get air out of your cooling systems, the radiator configurations and size. No matter what you do, you will always have cars that are designed to be operated not in Mexico City. And because of that, they will always be managed, because if you build a car that doesn't need to be managed in Mexico City, you're going to have a pretty slow car elsewhere. So I think there's not many races at altitude, are they? So I don't mind it, but I think it's one of those things that the suggestion made in the question is kind of quite a reasonable one with a challenge, but there's a lot of things you'd have to do. And I think you just end up with a Frankenstein's monster car being done. It's also worth noting that actually, although there's a lot of management, driving quickly while managing is actually a skill as well, which I think is underestimated. If you watch IndyCar coverage, they're always talking about it. Oh, look at this. Scott Dixon can do this while getting this fuel mileage and be that quick. It's incredible. No one ever seems to say that about Formula One, that actually, even though you might be doing lifting and coasting, being contained, etc., there's still an ability to be quick within those parameters as well. So I think that's important to remember. But I think Mexico will just remain a grand outlier, and I'm not sure there's a technological solution that would be implementable. You could try bolting on some extra external cooling like that, some mechanical cooling if you like, maybe, to try and pull a few bit more out, but I just then think you get into trouble with radiators, etc., and all sorts of things.
My respect to you, Ed, for answering that question entirely sincerely and not trying to make some kind of connection to the previous question about core fans versus new fans and then getting into cooling apparatus. So well done.
Excellent. Well, I like to rise above such things on here. I know you don't, but
no, I mean that's why I mentioned it. Like I'm lowbrow enough to have, I'm making it very clear that that's where my mind went initially. And if the question had come to me, my answer would have started along the lines of something just like, "Is that what the previous person meant by a core fan?"
And I would have gone. There was a brand called Chaparral, and then I would say put some oxygen in commentary booths. That's the main objective for next year.
That's a whole other objective. But actually, it's probably just worth bringing you in on the Mexico City spectacle because you're the one who's there in the commentary box calling the race. How do you find it? Do you think it's a problem, or do you think the storylines that the unique altitude creates offsets any processional nature, even though there wasn't a huge amount of that in the race, but there were points where people does that offset it?
No, I enjoy the fact that it's a completely different one. It is one that you leave the commentary booth with a migraine. That I do not enjoy, but the fact that not every race weekend is the same is what makes Formula One racing so strong. So why would you take that away?
Yeah, I think variety is the spice of life. Let's finish on a cliche. Anyway, before there's any more cliches, we should probably end it there. So thanks very much, Scott and Nelson. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. We're rapidly approaching the title run-in, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.